Good evening, class. Tonight I was going to do my video discussion board on religious freedom. We were supposed to this week look at least two primary sources that could help enhance a lesson for a American history class. And what I was looking at this week was the Fight for Religious Freedom in Virginia, which helped pave the way for the First Amendment freedom of religion clauses that would be eventually added to our Constitution. It started earlier in Virginia. Of course, we know that the Anglican Church was the established church in Virginia from pretty much from when Virginia started throughout the 1700s, and many dissenting religious groups would begin to form in Virginia after the First Great Awakening. Baptists and Methodists would start to push for freedom of conscience and worship. Some of the more famous ones being Samuel Davies and John Leland, which also helped influence this movement to push for religious freedom. Their actions and the persecution that was faced by many of these dissenters, whether they be dunked in water, even the stories of someone riding up into a church and beating a pastor. I mean, these types of things were common back then for those who tried to worship their own way. But these type of incidents kind of influenced some of the founders like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And historian Thomas Buckley mentions that Virginia served as a political core religious microcosm in which the whole nation could study the alternatives for a church-state relationship. This week I took two primary sources that I thought were pretty important behind the religious freedom movement in the state of Virginia. And that was going to, especially when it looks in regards to jurisprudence interpretations throughout American history. James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. This document, of course, was presented to the Virginia General Assembly in 1785, and it argued for complete religious liberty and against government support for any religion of any form. And this, of course, was going against the general assessment tax that was at that time. This document, of course, reveals Madison's view of religious freedom and how it started the path to officially separate church and state. And of course, this was going against Patrick Henry's general assessment bill that he was trying to push through. Madison argues that religion must be left to the individual to decide, and that this was a fundamental right just as important as other inalienable rights that were also mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. Madison assisted Jefferson in getting eventually the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom passed in 1786. Of course, Thomas Jefferson had already written this bill earlier. It did not get passed in its original form back then. At this time, in 1786, he was in France as a diplomat. So Madison is going to be the one that pushes this for Jefferson. Of course, they have correspondence back and forth about this. This bill, the Act for Establishing Religious Freedom, it opens with a persuasive justification of religious and intellectual freedom, and it also talks about specific guarantees of religious liberty and belief. The Virginia law that was eventually passed would be one of the sources that Congress would draw upon when drafting the Bill of Rights in 1789, which granted the free exercise of religion and prohibited Congress from abridging the freedom of religion. I believe that using both Memorial and Remonstrance and the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty can assist in examining the evolution of religious liberty in the United States. Virginia is very important to that movement, and being that our two main founding fathers that helped put together religious liberty, and we know that James Madison is the father of the Constitution, these two documents, these two primary sources are good to use in seeing how it eventually evolved. Both of these primary sources can be compared and analyzed with the Bill of Rights and the arguments for these rights within the state conventions that were happening at that time. You can also use these documents to evaluate the current environment of church and state relations and lead into a discussion on past and current court decisions regarding religious liberty. I know in my introductory American history classes, we did not discuss Memorial or the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty when discussing the formation of the First Amendment and freedom of religion. We didn't even mention it in our political science classes. However, it is very important when you are looking at how our freedoms developed, and especially if you are getting later and you're talking about current American history or not too far back into the 1940s and stuff, you're going to have some cases like Everson versus Board and Ingle versus Vitale, and you're going to look and see why these decisions were made, and they're going to base it back on Thomas Jefferson. Of course, the Dansbury letter, which, you know, they used the wall of separation of church and state. That wall is supposedly very tall to some Supreme Court justices. So it's kind of important to look at those things. So I believe using these primary sources from that Virginia time period of the late 18th century will help students see the foundation of religious liberty that we have today in our country. Thank you.